G'day! Welcome to True Blue History. I'm Adam Blum. Today's special guest is senior historian from the Australian War Memorial, Craig Tibbitts. We're discussing the Battle of El Alamein in 1942 and Australia's involvement. Hi Craig, welcome to the show.
G'day Adam, thank you.
No, Craig, thank you. It's an absolute honour and a privilege to have you on and just talk about El Alamein. So, after the war, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill stated that before El Alamein, we never had a victory. After El Alamein, we never had a defeat. Churchill was referring to the fact that El Alamein was a British victory as it occurred prior to America entering the war. To provide some context to Churchill's observation, can you share with us what the overall situation of the war was for the Allies prior to the three battles of El Alamein in 1942?
Yeah, sure. There was a lot going on, obviously, in a worldwide war. So yes, 1942 was really a year of multiple turning points in the war. Most wars don't have just one turning point; they have multiple ones, and it was certainly the case in the Second World War. Just with the United States came into the war right at the end of 1941 after the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor. So 6 months on, we're getting to mid 1942. The situation for the Allies was pretty grim when you consider in Europe, Nazi Germany was at the height of its powers and the height of its expansion of conquests throughout Europe. It was pushing deep into southern Russia, down towards the Caucasus. In North Africa, they were again on the rise and pushed right into Egypt, across the frontier into Egypt, and they were threatening to capture possibly Cairo and the Suez Canal if they weren't stopped. The war at sea was still, Germany was still on top in the war at sea, the Battle of the Atlantic against Allied supplies getting across the Atlantic to Britain. And in the air war, the air war was certainly ramping up in 1942, but by no means did they really start to have a heavy effect upon German industry and the population until a bit later, like in 1943 and 44. There were, so really the Axis forces, Germany, Italy, Japan, were at the height of their powers, and they'd seized an enormous amount of territory around the world. There'd been very few Allied victories, certainly no real major ones until 1942, and then these series of Allied victories gave some glimmer of hope. There was some significant ones out here in the Pacific, such as the Battle of Coral Sea, and then there was in May of 42. Then the Battle of Midway was probably one of the more significant ones in early June of 42. And then followed by Allied successes on land in the Pacific as well, such as at Guadalcanal, Milne Bay, then Kokoda. So it's basically just halting Japanese advances. We'll get to turning to pushing them back later. But in North Africa, it had been a back and forth war since 1940. It started in June of 1940, actually. A lot of people don't realise it started that early. And it was always a war of, often described as a seesaw battle between when one side can build up enough supplies and men and power to push the other side back across North Africa. And that had happened 3 or 4 times. So by the time we get to the middle of 1942, this is where it's really things are coming to the crunch, and there's significant forces at play there. So, and really the battles at El Alamein were really the turning point, probably the more significant one, the Second El Alamein in October, November, where we finally pushed the Axis forces back, and they were never able to recover from that. that was the end of the seesaw.
For those listeners, Craig, who are unfamiliar with the Western Desert Campaign, can you tell us why the Allies, which included Britain, Australia, New Zealand, South African, and Indian troops, and the Axis were the German and Italian troops, were in North Africa? And what was their objectives for being there? Why was it so important that they wanted North Africa?
Yeah, I think the overarching objectives really, the British were in Egypt, and they treated it really as a protectorate. They'd they'd had a treaty since the late 19th century, I think 1882 treaty. They'd progressively given the Egyptians more autonomy, so they were nominally an independent kingdom, but the reality was, because of the strategic significance of the Suez Canal, the British had it pretty much under a military occupation. That increased in when war broke out. So it was really under British domination. So yes, the Brits were keen to make sure that the Suez Canal didn't fall, because that obviously gave a connection between keeping the Mediterranean open and also sea contact with India too, and indeed Australia. So it's always been significant for that reason. For the Italians had one of their colonies, quite a large colony called Cyrenaica, which is today known as Libya. So when Nazi Germany managed to defeat France and kick the French army and the British army off the continent in mid-1940, by June 1940, the Italians under Mussolini saw an opportunity. Things were going so well for their ally, Nazi Germany, and things were very, very bad for France and Great Britain. So I think Mussolini saw an opportunity to get involved in the war and get something out of it, and possibly expanding his Italy's colonies right across all of North Africa, because there was French North Africa on to his west of his colony, and then Egypt to his east. So he could possibly even pick up all of North Africa as a big Italian colony. The Germans went there really to support the Italians in early 1941, because the Italians were clearly not going to be up to the task of defeating the British and their growing strength by 1941.
So, the Battles of El Alamein involved two charismatic and great generals going head to head in their efforts to claim victory. For the Allies, it was the Spartan general Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, and for the Axis, so the Germans, it was the Desert Fox, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. What personal characteristics or military actions led to them receiving those names, and do you think that they were accurate in describing each man?
Yes, I do think so. Montgomery was known as the Spartan general mainly because of his work and living habits. Spartan existence, meaning that he had none of the trappings of glory or rank. He lived a very, very simple life. All his equipment, and he travelled around in a caravan on land, which is very sparsely decked out. The way he dressed was not overly extravagant, and he had a daily routine, including his diet and eating habits, which was not at all lavish at all. He had very simple Spartan food. I think that's where he got his nickname from. I suppose the other characteristics of Monty were that he really excelled in training of troops, and he'd proven that mostly in the commands he'd held in the UK prior to taking over the 8th Army in North Africa. Yes, he has a great deal of belief in very, very thorough training of troops to make sure they're really ready for battle, fit and ready for battle. Very highly organised, and also very good at promoting morale with the troops too, was Monty. So he had quite a few good benefits to him. some detractors would say that he was often overly cautious, too meticulous, too slow, a bit of a plodder. But there's all sorts of different generals, and sometimes one type of general is called for at a certain time, and other times you need a completely different general. Um, yes, well, Rommel, he was often called the Desert Fox because he was a very, very crafty opponent. Um, very good on the attack, really, using those German armored blitzkrieg attacks. He was a master at it, and it's really, so this is one of the things with the German armored hierarchy. From their company commanders to regimental commanders, divisional commanders, and even Rommel at the army level commander, they were very, very well drilled in the latest techniques of armored warfare, and they'd practiced it in Poland, France, and some others in Russia by the middle of 1941 when that invasion took place. Highly, highly skilled. They knew how to get their infantry and their tanks and their artillery and their anti-tank guns and their air force ground support working very, very closely together, very well timed attacks, and moving in ways that often confounded the Allies, like making flank attacks with strong armored forces and using armor with great strength. A lot of weight of numbers. This is the whole idea of the large Panzer Division formations, and it took a while for the Allies to catch on and use similar techniques. And they did that to a certain extent at El Alamein too.
Could you argue, Craig, that during the First World War we learnt the all-arms tactics, and then we spent the better part of 20 years forgetting what Blitzkrieg was, and then the Germans picked up on it and they perfected it in the early stages of the Second World War? Would you agree that is a good point?
Yeah, I think that by 1918, the final year of the First World War, the Allies were far superior in combined arms. Tanks, artillery, infantry, and air support as well. But yes, when you think of the tanks of the First World War, they could not move fast enough, really. There were still problems you couldn't break clean through, and then the infantry support was still on foot. Not until you had armored half tracks and things like that, and better quality four-wheel drive lorries that could get across pretty rough, broken ground. Could you really envision armored breakthroughs where tanks became more powerful and faster? So the Germans, I think, really got onto the idea of the sorts of tanks that they were building in the 1930s and then early in the 1940s were designed for that sort of breakthrough, accompanied by mobile artillery and mobile infantry. Yeah, and I think the British mindset was using tanks in a different way, more of in an infantry support role. So that's where they grouped together in smaller numbers of tanks to support the infantry, whereas the Germans put together larger formations for massive breakthroughs.
What was Rommel and his Panzer Afrika Korps first objectives in the first battle, and what was their main advantages and disadvantages in that first battle?
Right. Well, it goes back to the end of May, 26th of May, 1942, which was probably Rommel's greatest achievement, greatest battle, which was the Battle of Gazala, and that culminated in what was it? I think about the 21st of June. So what's that? About three to 4 weeks later, with the capture of Tobruk, which people will remember the Australian 9th Division had spent the best part of 1941 holding on under siege at Tobruk. But yes, the Battle of Gazala hooked right round to the south of the British line there, which was about 60 kilometres to the west of Tobruk. There was extremely fierce fighting at Gazala in the Cauldron area between there and Tobruk over several weeks. And then the Germans finally overpowered the Allies. The Australians weren't involved on the ground in that battle. And then Tobruk was taken. And that was just shocked everyone, certainly shocked Churchill, and really, really struck a terrible caught of the poor morale amongst the British to lose Tobruk and that battle at Gazala so badly. So they were in headlong retreat to the Egyptian frontier, heading eastwards. And then they crossed over into, they tried to make a stand on the Egyptian frontier, but then figured they couldn't really. The Panzer Army, Africa, which was combined German and Italian, after taking Tobruk, capitalised on that and raced across the border, just trying to keep the Allies off balance, don't let them get set in defence. And look, the objective was really for them, if they possibly could, drive all the way to Alexandria, Cairo, and maybe even capture the Suez Canal. That was the ultimate objective if they possibly could do that. And for a moment, it seemed that might happen. The British had real difficulty in establishing a strong enough defensive line to stop them, but ultimately they did at El Alamein.
During the first battle, one Australian battalion, the 2nd 28th, was almost completely destroyed after being surrounded by German tanks. Can you tell us what had gone wrong and why help didn't arrive in time to help them?
Yeah, it's been a little while since I've read in detail about that, but that was the Battle of Miteria Ridge, sometimes called, the Australians called it Ruin Ridge. The battalion that was there was the 2nd 28th, and they were assigned to capture that ridge. So it was in support of another ridge, Ruwaisit Ridge, that I think the New Zealanders had captured and were also having trouble holding. The fighting at First Alamein really went for the entire month of July, almost the entire month of July. So this was towards the end of the fighting, where they're really just trying to. They'd stopped the Germans, and they were just trying to gain advantageous ground at these certain ridges like Miteria and Ruwaisit Ridge. But usually what happened was they could capture the objectives, but then they were very strongly counterattacked by German Air Force, bombing, strafing, and usually combined infantry and panzer attacks, whether they be German or Italian tanks, would come and outflank them, surround them, and reduce them. And that's certainly what happened. The 2nd 28th got to their objective on Ruin Ridge and captured prisoners there, I think Italian prisoners. But then the British armour was unable to get through to them in time. It's always one of those very debatable ones. There was always a bit of argy-bargy between the tanks and the infantry in the North African campaign. You know, sometimes the tanks were accused of not trying hard enough, or not taking enough risks. But often, I'll tell you what, they took enough risks. I think the British tankers, they were up against really formidable enemy. And from what I recall, I think there was a lot of communications breakdown between Australian infantry and the British tanks that led to them not being able to get through to them in order to save the disaster there. I think it was about 500 Australians. I think about 60 were killed and nearly 500 were taken prisoner out of that battalion. So they were almost wiped out. But usually when a battalion goes into battle, they don't put all of them in. They'll keep a small reserve out of the battle. So if something like that happens, they have a nucleus of experienced men to rebuild. And that battalion, the 2nd 28th, was rebuilt with fresh men, and they participated in the second Battle of El Alamein.
It's a key point that you touch on, that with battalions, absolutely. And some historians have suggested that Montgomery's command style and strategies learned during World War One contributed to his success at El Alamein, as he was able to adapt his tactics to force Rommel to use a defensive strategy that would ultimately benefit the Eighth Army. What's your perspective about this observation? Do you agree or disagree?
Well, yeah, in some respects, I would say I agree in that. Often people say about particularly the second battle of El Alamein is it was fought similar to a First World War battle in that there was a very strong, in-depth front line, which neither side could get around because it's only about 50 kilometres long from El Alamein, whereas El Alamein's on the coast, where there's a road and also a railway track that goes up, hugs the coast. And about 50 kilometres down to the south is what's called the Qatar Depression. And that's quite a steep escarpment, quite large. And then down in the escarpment, there's very, very soft sand, and heavy vehicles can't go down there. So it's a bottleneck, really, of about 50 kilometres. So the line was about that long, particularly concentrated in the north, because that was what you had to defend, was the coast road. And that's where the Australians were. So, yeah, there was massed artillery, barbed wire, trenches, thousands and thousands of mines and defences in great depth. So, it was like a Western Front battle. So Montgomery had experience of that. He knew how to conduct a Western Front battle from his experience in the British forces in the First World War, and that style of battle suited him too. Like he had the luxury of several months of being able to build up his forces at El Alamein after he took over in August of 42, and make sure all the defences there so the Germans couldn't break through, and then prepare for 3 months really for his own offensive until he had everything he needed and everyone was trained and everything was ready to go. So as far as other tactics, one of the other things he did was he did put all the armour together in the 10th Corps, which was essentially an armoured corps. Whether that worked all that well, I don't know, because of the very static nature of that battle, and you couldn't outflank anybody, and there was massed artillery and huge amounts of minefields to get a large armoured force through. So he kind of had the right idea in doing, matching the Germans with large armoured formations, but it still didn't solve the problem that Allied infantry and tank forces still were not coordinating as well as German ones were on the battlefield. I think that would probably be my two observations.
So that's the end of the first battle, and we now move into the second, so the stages of the second battle. So can you share with us what the second battle was about and who at this point was winning, the Allies or the Germans?
Right. Well, after the first battle, as I said, that took really all of July, and it was pretty clear that the Germans weren't going anywhere. They were stuck. One of the problems was because they'd advanced so far into Egypt. This was always a problem in this sort of terrain in the desert, is supplies. So getting everything that the army needs, food, fuel, ammunition, but particularly fuel was the problem. That was becoming increasingly difficult and critical for the Axis forces. And because the Allies were relatively close to their bases at Cairo and Alexandria and the Suez, they were much closer now. So it was easier for them. And during those 3 months from the end of July, so through August, September, and most of October, the Allies were really winning the race in building up their forces. Now, they built their forces up to about 200,000 men. And really, I think the Axis forces there could bear about half that. I think in most categories, like tanks, guns, men, artillery, the Allies, by the time they were ready to go towards the end of October to commence the second Battle of El Alamein, they outnumbered the Axis forces about 2-1 in just about every category. So that was a luxury that Montgomery had that hadn't been allowed to previous commanders, was he had 3 months to prepare. Most other commanders, there was always Churchill and the Chief of Staff breathing down their necks saying, come on, attack, you've got to give us victories. Monty was allowed to prepare until he was ready to go. The other thing was there was an intervening battle too. There were actually 3 battles at El Alamein. So they're normally referred to as the first Battle of El Alamein, the July one. The second Battle of El Alamein is October, November. The one in the middle is the third, and that's generally called the Battle of El Alamein Halfa, I should say. Now that was when the Germans really they managed to get enough tanks together and enough fuel scraped together to have one last crack at seeing if they could outflank the British and break through and blow open that Alamein line. So this is right at the end of August. I think it's the night of the 30th of August. They tried to do what they did at Gazala back in May, which was hook around to the south of a very powerful armed force. But this is an interesting aspect about the war in North Africa, indeed all over the world. But intelligence, the Allies had intelligence through the ultra intercepts. They could read German dispatches, and they knew. See, at Gazala, through ultra, the Allies had known that the Rommel was going to attack, but they didn't know where. At Alam Halfa, they knew he was going to attack, and they knew exactly where and exactly when. So they were lying in wait for him, and gave him a pretty bloody nose, and that attack didn't go anywhere. It was over in a couple of days.
How important was the air battles that were going on? Were they similar to what was going on at Tobruk earlier in 41, or was there the air war going on as well at El Alamein?
Yeah, definitely. The air war was a very important part of it, and it was going on constantly, really, day and night. And gradually, again, like with the other arms, the Allies built up more and more squadrons. I think they've doubled their number of squadrons that were there, both fighters and bombers. Of course, Australians flew in some of those Desert Air Force squadrons too, and some in RAF squadrons. There was New Zealanders, also South Africans, and possibly Canadians there too. And people don't realise this, but there was several squadrons of US Army Air Force fighting by the time of El Alamein too, both fighters and bombers. So they didn't have forces there on the ground, but the Americans were fighting in the air over El Alamein with us. Yes, and really a lot of it was just attacking their field positions, but particularly the great advantage that the Air Force could do is they could roam miles behind the line and just shoot the crap out of every bit of supplies and fuel and spare parts that Rommel's forces needed. And so basically starve him of getting any supplies at all. That was a great advantage. And also attacking both the Royal Navy and the Air Force, the Desert Air Force, attacking any Axis shipping that's trying to get across the Mediterranean to resupply them with everything they needed. That was a really big part of it too.
So could you say, Craig, that at this point Rommel was like his forces were like obviously his supplies were running low, and he was at a very he was very close to a breaking point. Would you agree with that?
Well, yes, I think so. Well, the breaking point only if he tried to push his luck further and go on the offensive. I think it became pretty clear he couldn't break through anymore. So he went on the defensive, and he's relatively safe defensively. But I'm sure they must have known, because the Germans had intelligence on the Allies as well, that the force across the road, the Monty's force, was just growing stronger and stronger and stronger. And he was screaming for more tanks, more men, more fuel, and of course he was not getting, because Hitler wouldn't give him what he asked for, and also a lot of it was getting sunk on the way over the Mediterranean. A lot of that's they needed more and more tanks in Russia at that time, and North Africa was basically, no, we can't afford to give you very many at all. So yes, I think breaking point didn't come until after the attack really set in, and but he knew he was pretty in a hopeless situation, I would say.
So during the third battle, Montgomery ordered the Australian 9th Division North to engage the enemy. What were the conditions that the Australians faced as Rommel sent his strongest units against them? And Rommel is quoted as having said, "If I had to take hell, I would use the Australians to take it and the New Zealanders to hold it." Do you think that perhaps it was his familiarity with the intensity of these troops after Tobruk that influenced him to send his best troops to attack to drive them back. Do you agree with that or disagree?
Well, I think that Rommel certainly knew the qualities of the Australian troops. It was the same troops, the Ninth Division, that had been at Tobruk and had thwarted his every attempt to take the place. So he knew they were very, very good troops, very good on the attack end and certainly on the defensive as well. It was more to do with the fact that the Australian Ninth Division was right on the northern sector along the coast, which was, I think, as I mentioned before, that was the critical part of the front. Yeah, it had to protect against breakthrough there. And that's the Australians were put there for that reason. And then when the big attack, the second Battle of El Alamein, opened on the night of 23rd of October 42, the Australians they had objectives to attack, as did many other divisions. It was a multi-division attack mostly along the northern sector and into part of the central sector. And though most of the objectives, the first objectives were taken, they took territory off the Germans and Italians. But there was no breakthrough, and this was the problem. That then became the problem. Okay, we've made some ground, we've defeated and captured quite a few, but the line hasn't broken. And now what's happening is, Rommel kept his best armoured formations, both Italian but particularly his German panzer divisions, in reserve to counter-attack where it looked like there was danger of a breakthrough. And that was one area was obviously in the northern sector. So, we drew upon us a great deal of heat from some of those best panzer divisions and like the 90th Light Division there as well. So there was very, very intense fighting there over several days. It was called what was called like crumbling operations, where the Australians then turned from driving westwards and then they drove northwards towards the coast to try and wipe out the German and Italian forces that were there. And the battles just became more and more intense over the ensuing days as there's artillery, German aerial attack, and then German panzer divisions attacking, trying to destroy the Australians that were there. So suffered pretty heavy casualties there. But they stuck it out.
After defeating the Axis troops, what mistakes do you think the Allies made in not preventing the Germans from escaping North Africa? So, in your opinion, where did we go wrong?
It was after the ultimate victory was clear, really. I would say the 4th of November, I think, was when, about the 4th or 5th of November, when Rommel actually ordered the retreat. There wasn't a lot that could be done to stop the Axis forces that were still mobile. There were precious few tanks and trucks, but those forces that were still mobile were able to break contact and get away. After that intense fighting, I don't think there could have been an Allied response to mop them up and surround them and destroy them all. But a lot of the Axis forces, particularly the Italian ones, because the Germans gave priority to petrol to their tanks and vehicles. The Italians, you can have some if there's any left over. So a lot of their tanks and vehicles had to be abandoned because they were running out of petrol, and a lot of their infantry were just on foot as well.
So some historians, Craig, have pointed out that the loss at El Alamein fractured the relationship between the Germans and the Italians. While making their retreat, do you think the Germans largely abandoned their Italian allies, or was it a matter of purely self-interest, or was there something else involved?
Well, I think the relationship between the Germans and the Italians had always been fractured. The Germans mostly had a pretty low opinion of their Italian allies. I think sometimes unfairly. Some of the Italian forces there were pretty poor. Sometimes it's because poorly equipped and very poorly led, poor morale. But some of their forces, particularly their armoured formations and some of their infantry, were pretty good. So they don't deserve the universal bagging. But yeah, look, the German forces had a much higher opinion of themselves than the Italians. And when it came to the point, whereas we need to get out of here, its priority goes to us. And we need to preserve as much of the Africa core as we can. And as many of the Italians that can get away, so be it. They ended up regrouping in Tunisia and fought on together, the Germans and the Italians, until the end of the North African campaign in mid-May of 1943. So the fighting would go on in what was formerly the northwestern French colonies of Africa, so like Tunisia and Morocco, places like that.
So, very little has been written about the role that the Egyptians played in these battles being fought in their homeland. Were they involved in a minor way, or did they basically have no involvement at all?
Well, the Egyptians certainly had an army, although I don't know that they were involved in much fighting, although they would have had garrison duties, I suppose, throughout Egypt. I'm not aware of all the stuff that I've read on those campaigns of them getting involved in the fighting. They were certainly never part of the order of battle of the British Eighth Army, as far as I'm aware. I do remember when I was at I was at El Alamein years ago. This is 2002. There's a little museum there, and this is run by the Egyptians. And I do remember whether it was a diorama or a painting, large painting of Egyptian soldiers storming German positions, and I sort of wondered whether that was based on reality or not. I'd have to do more research in that area, but I'm not aware of them getting involved in much fighting at all.
I just thought, I'd bring it up, just touch on whether they'd been involved or not. So I thought it'd just be something that we put in. So just to finish up, we started with a Winston Churchill quote. So perhaps we should close with one. So after the victory at El Alamein, and still a long way from the end of the war, Churchill said, "Now this is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning." Do you agree with his observation, and do you think the victory at El Alamein gave Churchill hope of winning the war?
Certainly, certainly some hope in that they would be able to successfully conclude the campaign in North Africa, because for both sides, the Axis and the Allies, they shouldn't have been there. It was seen as a sideshow, a waste of resources. So ideally, you'd rather win it than lose it. But I think it became clear after El Alamein that they were going to be able to wrap things up successfully in North Africa. And it was, a demonstration that, look, we can beat Rommel, we can defeat his armoured forces, going face to face with him. So there's some encouragement there. The other part too, more hope that they would win the war on the war overall came, with the successes of the in the Pacific, the successes of the Russians on the Eastern Front, the turning of the tide in the Battle of the Atlantic in mid-1943, which really gave a lot of confidence that they were going to be able to successfully invade Western Europe. But back to go back to the North African campaign, what's interesting too is that just a few days after Rommel began his retreat in defeat from El Alamein, is that very large British and American forces made an amphibious landing in French Northwest Africa, Morocco and Tunisia, called Operation Torch, and began on the 8th of November. So just as they're retreating, a big Allied force arrives in their rear, and so they had them bottled up. It still took a few more months. I think it was 4 more months to mop them all up and conclude North Africa. They captured at Tunis about 230,000 German and Italian troops. So it was bigger. I think it was about the biggest capture of Axis troops in the war. It's sort of in one hit. Stalingrad being another one. Yeah. So it certainly did give it was one of those many turning points that gave the Allies some pretty clear indications that things were turning around and we were winning, and we were going to be able to go on and win that war.
Absolutely. So, what should Australians take away from El Alamein? Like, what should we take away from the fighting that was El Alamein in 1942?
Well, I think in some respects, really, it's important. We take a great deal of pride in the performance of our armed forces at El Alamein. Let's not forget those in the Air Force and those operating in the Navy in the Mediterranean too. But particularly, obviously, it was a land battle. The Ninth Division, which had gained a great reputation for its defence of Tobruk the previous year in 1941, only enhanced its reputation as being a really tough, um, good unit, and both on the attack and defence, good division. Um, so really enhanced our reputation as soldiers, and that stead us put us in very good stead, because the Ninth Division went back and fought in the Southwest Pacific as well through to the end of the war. And of course, the other thing is, the loss of life. Um, I think, but for all the battles between early July, through to the end of the fighting at El Alamein in early November, the Australians lost at least 5,500 casualties. Okay, so that includes casualties, the majority wounded, some badly wounded, may not recover very well, but I think it's 1,259 was the figure of dead. Now, about 620 in the July fighting, and about the same number in the October, November fighting. So, yeah, 12, 15, 1,259 died, and then some no doubt would have died of their wounds if they couldn't recover. So, significant loss of life. In the Australian Army campaigns of the Second World War, I think the only other one that exceeds that would be the campaign of Malaya, which culminated in the loss of Singapore, which was also in 1942. But El Alamein, heavy fighting, heavy casualties, a lot of people lost people in that. And so, the commemoration of it, we commemorated at the War Memorial. There's a beautiful Commonwealth War Grave and the Alamein Memorial there. If you ever go to Egypt and visit it, it's really, really a moving place to see. There's German and Italian memorials there. Let's not forget they lost an enormous amount of men there too. I think overall the 8th Army at El Alamein for those few months lost about 30,000 casualties, and the Axis forces probably up to 60,000. A lot of those being captured. There's enormous amounts captured in early November when the retreat began. So the figures can be a bit rubbery. So yeah, big battles, biggest battle of the North African campaign for sure.
Absolutely. So you could say, Craig, that almost 100,000 men on both sides were lost in the North African campaign.
Well, in that fighting at El Alamein, yeah, both Axis and Allied forces, total casualties would have been 90, approaching 100,000 between July, August, September, November.
Just staggering. So, what was it for you that made you get into studying the Battle of El Alamein?
Oh, I think I'd always been interested in those campaigns since I was a youngster, and then when I started working at the War Memorial in 2000, just a couple of years later, I got a wonderful opportunity to go on my first staff study tour. So we went with a group from the Imperial War Museum in London, and we went on a tour of Greece and Crete and the El Alamein battlefields. And so I had to give a talk there on a particular battle, which was to do with the first Alamein, first battle of El Alamein. And yeah, I maintained my interest in it, kept reading about it ever since, really. It's an amazing sort of battlefield because it's like the surface of the moon, it's just completely flat. It's just sand and dirt and bits of shrubs and little rocks and pebbles everywhere. It's like the surface of the moon because you can see it's just flat, completely flat everywhere. There's hardly anything out there even today. And when you stand on one of the key pieces of ground, they're only like 20 meters high. right? Just so it's really, when you say it's like Tel El Isa, which is like, or the ridge that runs along the coastal road, they're little more than just mounds above, you know, above the road surface. And you can barely even see that the ground is higher. But when you get on top of it, like Tel El Isa, because it is about 20 meters, 23 meters high, when you stand on it, then you can see, oh, okay, I can see everything from here. And so just even the slightest elevation of ground in such a flat expanse becomes key ground. And that's where a lot of people lost lives fighting over little lumps of land like that.
Absolutely. It's a key point you touch on too, because it reminds me a lot of the high ground in the First World War around Ypres. And when you're talking about that, I'm sitting here thinking, well, actually, that's reminding me very much so of the flat ground around the Ypres salient.
Yeah, so I agree, because I've visited those battlefields too, and yeah, when you think of the Passchendaele Ridge, you can barely tell it's only a little bit higher than the ground in front of it. So
Absolutely. So, just to finish up, Craig, what are you currently working on at the memorial?
well, I've spent the last 5 years in the military history section. Worked on a project on the medical legacies of the Vietnam War. Now, I was a research project manager on that, and it resulted in a book authored by Dr. Peter Ewell. It's called The Long Shadow, and that's a study of the Australian Vietnam veterans and their medical legacies since the war. So, yeah, The Long Shadow. It only came out just last October. So that's what I spent the last 5 years doing. And then since then, just working in the military history section, just doing a variety of different tasks. So I like working on that because of the variety. I get to work across all sorts of different conflicts and topics, and also the production of last post ceremony stories too, where each evening at the War Memorial they read out a little biography of an Australian soldier who died in one of the wars. So that takes up a lot of our time too.
Yeah, it's a very special service that you do right at the end of the day, and it's very touching, like it is at the Manning Gate. It's every night that they play the last post. It's very special.
Yeah, and I've written a few about people that died at El Alamein. I've written a few recently because, as I said, there's battles between July and November is 1,259. So there's plenty of last post stories there. And so because of my interest in those battles, I tend to pick a couple of those and write them up.
Absolutely. Craig, it's been great to have you on and just talk about El Alamein and Australia's involvement in it. And it's just been a really great chat with you to sit and just learn so much about the battle that was in 1942. So, Craig, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Adam. Been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review for the podcast on whatever platform you get your podcasts. And if you feel like supporting us, you can now via our Patreon page. That's patreon.com/truebluehistory, or buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/truebluehistory, and check out our new website, truebluehistory.com, for more great content.